Let's pray. Lord, we arrive here today from so many different situations and different perspectives and different experiences, but we are unified in our desire to hear you speak into our lives, our desire to find our strength in you, and our desire for guidance in what you want from us and for us. Lord, we ask that you bless us with discerning and receptive hearts, and we pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. My name's Wendy, and I'm part of the pastoral team here at Mission Gathering. And I feel like I'm having to talk really quiet because it feels like this is gonna, so just so you know, Rodney, let me know if I'm getting too loud. Before we get into this message, I want to remind everybody that our next series is Ask Anything, and that's what we want you to do. We want you to submit your most fearless and your most out-of-the-box questions. You can do that anonymously right on our website. You can do that on our Facebook page, and you can message or email Pastor Brandon or myself with any questions you have. And in the next 2 or 3 weeks, both of us, at some point together and separately, will be answering all the questions that you would not think are okay to ask in church. Also keep in mind that we are hoping to have time for a few questions at the end of this service. So as we're talking, anything that you think you might want to ask, write that down so you can ask it at the end of service. So, here we go. As if I don't share enough of my own baggage here, I want to show you a picture. So this is my bedroom after the house cleaners come. So every other week, I pile all the clutter that I haven't had the time to organize in that period of time and put it on my bed so the house cleaners can have access to clean the best possible. So on this afternoon, I was working on my sermon, knowing I had to get notes over to Rodney, who has so graciously made clear, I work all weekend, I need you to get this to me. Also knowing that even if I got him the notes on Sunday morning, which is pretty much what happened, thank you, Rodney and Brian, so much, that they would be gracious and amazing. But anyway, I was working on the sermon, knowing I had to clear this, and then got a call from my son, who had, for the second time in a month, probably locked his keys in his car. So I start walking around the house in the yard to make sure that his remote hasn't fallen. He thinks it's fallen off his keychain, to see if it's somewhere around there. Come upon this disgusting mess left by my 100-pound dog, who's too infirm to undergo surgery, so we just deal with helping her to have quality of life at this point and dealing with the accompanying occasional grossness. This meant I now had to pull out the hose, hook it up to the utility sink in the house so I'm working with warm water to clean the mess and clean the dog while I'm on this endless phone call to roadside assistance so Donovan can get his keys out of his car. Meanwhile, my bed still looks like a hoarder's wonderland. The sermon is not written. Rodney for sure does not have notes. And on top of this, my mental background is always this low hum of, we'll just call it current events. So this is just one example of the fairly consistent state of chaos that is our family's existence. And I know from talking to so many of you that we're not alone. If you haven't guessed, the topic today is going to be the intersection of spirituality and mental health. And in a few minutes, we're actually going to be talking with my new friend, therapist Lori Wevers. So I'm really excited about that. She's awesome. Anyway, yeah, she's one of the people that I wish I had more time to do recreational and social things. Anyway, a recent CNN article titled "Too Much Bad News Can Make You Sick" stated that our brains are hardwired to process stress relating to trauma by entering what is known as fight, flight, freeze mode before returning to a restful state. However, constant exposure to trauma can derail our ability to cope healthily and hinder our ability to return to a relaxed state. Every time we experience or hear about a traumatic event, we go into stress mode. We might go numb or have an overactive fear response to the perceived threat. Our physiology is triggered to release stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Ideally, after the perceived threat is resolved, the body's resting state of homeostasis should be regained. However, recurrent exposure to traumatic events leads to adrenal fatigue, which can lead to being tired in the morning, lack of restful sleep, anxiety and depression, as well as a multitude of other symptoms. And God knows we are definitely being exposed to an overabundance of distressing news. The article goes on to address the importance of self-care, the importance of downtime, the importance of unplugging. But for most of us, that's a lot easier said than done. When I first started coming to Mission Gathering, one of the first things I heard Rich McCullen, who's the founding pastor here, say is that everyone should be in therapy. And if you know Rich, you probably heard him say that also. This was a really welcome affirmation for me, because I had actually been part of a church where there was a church split caused by somebody seeking, a leader in the church, seeking psychiatric help instead of relying entirely on the power of God to heal. Totally missing the point that God's provision sometimes comes in the form of therapy or even medication. But even with the confirmation that there's no shame in seeking help or in prioritizing self-care, I sometimes feel almost ashamed of indulging my stress or my anxiety or prioritizing self-care, because relatively speaking, I have so little to complain about. And I realize that that's a universal thing, that feeling that we shouldn't be prioritizing self-care because we should be happy with what we have. So this following passage, I've got a long introduction before I get to this passage, but it's one I really grappled with including. It's long. Like a lot of the Psalms, it's theologically problematic. Those of us who have any type of fundamentalist background have probably heard this particular psalm disconcertingly misinterpreted. But as we look at it together, I'm going to ask you to regard this exclusively from the perspective of human anguish and personal conflictedness, because that's what it's included in the Bible to represent. So to provide a little bit of background, this is written by King David, who has just spent the last 8 months probably in total anguish. He has used his powerful position to exploit and possibly even rape Bathsheba. She's ended up pregnant. David tries to bring her husband home, Uriah, her husband Uriah, home from war, so he'll sleep with her. He refuses to sleep with her because he realizes that his soldiers are in distress and on the front lines, and he thinks it would dishonor them. So David sends the soldier Uriah back out into the most dangerous situation that he can find, knowing that he would be killed. Nice guy that David is, he does bring Bathsheba home to his palace. She has the baby, but the baby lives only a week or so. Something else I want you to keep in mind, as I write sermons, that was weird. As I write sermons, I do a lot of it by voice dictation. And as I was providing this background account, I noticed that my voice was becoming more and more contemptuous of David, which was a good reminder that our point here is to regard David as just human and someone who has made bad choices and is in mental anguish. So this is Psalm 51, and it's 1 through 17. I'm going to take a drink of water because, like I said, it's long. It says, "Have mercy on me, O God. Because of your unfailing love, because of your great compassion, blot out the stains of my sins. Wash me clean from my guilt. Purify me from my sin, for I recognize my rebellion. It haunts me day and night. Against you and you alone I have sinned. I have done what is evil in your sight. You will be proved right in what you say, and your judgment against me is just. For I was born a sinner, yes, from the moment my mother conceived me, but you desire honesty from the womb, teaching me wisdom even there. Purify me from my sins, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Give me back my joy again. You have broken me. Now let me rejoice. Don't keep looking at my sins. Remove the stain of my guilt. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. Do not banish me from your presence, and don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and make me willing to obey you. Then I will teach your ways to rebels, and they will return to you. Forgive me for shedding blood, O God who saves. Then I will joyfully sing of your forgiveness. Unseal my lips, O Lord, that my mouth may praise you. You do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer one. You do not want a burnt offering. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. You will not reject a broken and repentant heart, O God. So I highlighted a couple of those verses because I so resonate with begging God to change who I am or change my tendency to make bad choices. But David here also understands that part of redemption is the opportunity to use our experience, even the bad ones, and especially the bad ones, to help others connect with God. And David has total certainty about God's love and grace and acceptance. At the same time, the reason I included this whole passage is that David is internalizing this massive self-condemnation, and that does not come from God. That comes from himself. And this is one of the reasons this is such a theologically problematic verse to try and interpret from a Christian perspective, because this is included to represent human experience. Sometimes I get a little bit worried about how much I love what God is doing here at Mission Gathering, because I know that God will sometimes move us from where we are to where our experiences will benefit a lack. I'm trusting that's not going to happen anytime real soon. But that said, one of the things I really love about this place and our people is how we embrace abundant living. We don't believe God is looking to penalize us for having a good time or appreciating and even indulging in recreational aspects of life. But I also know that this can put us at risk of missing what spiritual abundant living is. Galatians 5:13 and 14 says, "For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters, but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." So our sacrifice of whatever, our time, our money, our resources, can be a scary thing because it can feel like we're giving up something that we will never get back. But I want to make really clear that God's economy is not like the stock market. We are never in danger of risking our retirement. We won't ever be in the position that we give so much to the work of God or so strive to make ourselves better for the good of the kingdom that we come out in debt. Galatians 6:7-9 says, "Don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit." So let's not get tired of doing what is good. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. And as much as that's a really wonderful message, and there's no doubt that that's a wonderful message, I can also feel like a lot of pressure. I want to share a video clip, and I know some of us have seen this video, and it addresses the failures of one specific denomination when it comes to LGBTQ youth and community, but it's honestly the story of far too many denominations. But I'm just showing like a 30-second clip. Do we have that?
I've talked to tons of parents who have been great, but I've also talked to a few who I think could never, at least in the conversation I had with them, get past that this is not what I want for my child. All I could do at the end of those conversations is call their kid back and say, well, they weren't willing to listen to me, but I want you to know that I love you and I'm here for you, and I want you to call me when you need to, because you're not alone.
I included that clip because this reflects the heart of so many of our people here. We are compelled towards this type of intervention and this type of ministry of letting those who feel unappreciated or unlovely know how precious and valuable they are. But we must be taking care of ourselves to take care of others, whether it's our family or our partner, our kids, our congregation, our extended community. Formal therapy isn't an imperative for everyone. You might find that support from your family, from our pastoral care team here, from family and friends, from recovery support groups, but some type of support is imperative. To be there in the capacity in which we are required for the kingdom and for ourselves and for our communities, and in the capacity that so many of us want to be available, requires self-care and sound mental and emotional and spiritual health, and that comes only from having a support system. Ideally, God needs to be central to that support system, but God can't be solely that support system. Ecclesiastes 4:9-12 says, "Two people are better off than one, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. Likewise, two people lying close together can keep each other warm, but how can one be warm alone? A person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but two can stand back to back and conquer. Three are even better, for a triple braided cord is not easily broken." Man, right? And with this, I want to introduce Lori Wevers. Come on up. Let's give her a hand, because this is not an easy thing. Yeah, you can grab that, have a seat. I want to thank Jacob for the idea of bringing these chairs out here and actually bringing them out. Thank you so much.
I told her I felt like Oprah.
So I'm going to get situated, but let me ask you, the first question is, can you tell us what a spiritual director is?
Yeah, so hi everybody. I feel very much at home. I am a fellow progressive Christian, so here we are. So I am a mental health therapist and a spiritual director, and a lot of people haven't heard of spiritual direction, and I hadn't either until I had to experience spiritual direction, which ended up saving my spirituality in a lot of different ways. So spiritual direction is often really difficult to define because it includes a whole heck of a lot of mystery, because God being the essence of mystery. But what spiritual direction does is it helps people explore the spiritual aspect of being human, whether it be cleaning up a huge dump that your dog took, or your kids losing their keys, or it could be something more spiritual like the pain you experienced from a pastor in the past, or those types of things. How it's different than therapy is that it is less goal-oriented. So what I'm doing as a spiritual director is different than what I'm doing as a therapist. So a spiritual direction session generally happens once per month, and I'm doing a whole lot of listening to the more in the room. Maybe there's a common thread that you haven't thought of, or your therapist hasn't thought of, or just while you're talking, I'm noticing that there's maybe an invitation towards greater self-compassion, or a belief about God that isn't very loving. So my job is to just be asking a lot of questions to help you explore that. I'm not preaching to you, I'm not telling you what to believe, but just asking questions to kind of help you explore those pieces.
So I got the impression when we talked that you intentionally pursue serving communities like ours that are progressive and diverse and committed to the spiritual aspects of social justice. And I'm wondering if you can share why this is, if that's right, because we didn't really talk about that, and maybe tie that into as much of your personal testimony as you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, so I can even tell, just being here with you this morning, that I get sort of teary-eyed because of the passion that I have for all of you. Because my guess is, a lot like myself, you've had some church wounds. Being progressives, a lot of times we're progressives because we're not fundamental, potentially for a reason. So, yes. Yes. So a little bit about my story. I grew up in a very fundamental home. My grandfather was a pastor and a closet alcoholic in a very fundamental tradition that I was a part of, which of course was never talked about. So growing up, there was definitely the God is someone to be afraid of. Using God in the middle of punishment. You didn't do this at church, so you're going to get spanked when you get home, or pieces like that. Crazily, throughout this experience, I think even from a very young age, I always had this deep knowing that Jesus was better than all of that. And so I knew that I was always looking for people on the fringes. And so at some point I decided that I wanted to be a youth pastor. And I don't think I shared this with you either, Wendy, but right around my high school graduation, the pastor of my church at that time took me into his office and said, you know, no one's going to hire a female youth pastor. So you better, find something else to do. And I remember even at that time, even though I had only grown up in a fundamental church, being like, well, that's ridiculous, because this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I feel called to do. So I went to a pretty conservative Christian school. In my junior year of college, I had to do an internship as a youth minister, and they sent me to rural Nebraska. So I'm originally from the Midwest, so you might hear some of my words too. Yeah. So my junior year, I did this internship. It was supposed to last 6 months, and I only made it 5. My first night there, the youth pastor had said to me, just so you know, I only do this for a paycheck. My very first night as a college student with so much passion to finally be released into her vocation. And so I had one of my professors who would visit everyone in their internships around 4 or 5 months. And the moment he saw me, he said, you're going home tomorrow. I had lost a ton of weight. I was depressed. It was the first time I'd ever had suicidal thoughts, and was just at the very bottom of, I hate the church. And if this is all about God, then I think I might hate God too. So of course I had 1 year left of ministry school, which I didn't give to about. And so in my senior year, I had just a really wise professor who just noticed that something had changed in me. And he said, you should probably see a spiritual director. And I was like, what's that? I don't, that sounds like something stupid Christian that I would do, So I ended up going mostly because it was free. And I will say that going to see a spiritual director probably saved my spirituality and potentially my life. So seeing this spiritual director, I was able to really have all my feelings about God and the church, and then also realizing how much of that really was intertwined with my relationship with my family, and how those two really couldn't be separated, because God and the abusive narcissistic father I had growing up was just all into one. So I still Skype with that same spiritual director 12 years later, and she has, I could cry, talking about how she has literally held me in her arms, and just really been the beauty of God that has wooed me back to spirituality. So
I'm going to do these questions out of order because in talking about that, you acknowledge the need for self-care. And I know in my own life, this makes a huge difference. When I neglect it, I'm not doing well. And for me, this looks like meditation and sometimes abstaining from electronics and social media, making sure I'm exercising, sometimes fasting and, whatever I'm eating or, staying away from alcohol for a period of time or whatever that is. But can you address self-care from a therapeutic perspective?
Yeah, like as a therapist or just self-care for everyone in general?
Both, yeah.
Both, yeah. Well, early on as a therapist, I wanted to help everyone and save everyone, so I burned out real fast. So having to add certain things into my life to keep me sane.
I want to just break in the boundaries. Boundaries are
Boundaries, for sure. And especially, I'm just going to put a shout out to anyone out there who might have a narcissistic parent. Boundaries are absolutely essential, and we can talk about that another time too. So for me, I'm also a single female, so getting the physical touch that I need also is an important form of self-care. So for me, I have to get a massage every month. It is essential for my own mental health, my spiritual health, my connection with my body, my own sexuality. So for me, that's been like, I have to have it scheduled every month. I need to get away and be by myself. And that's the only way I'm going to be able to carry everyone's stories and my own story. And I think too often in the church, too, we're told that self-care is selfish. But we are the beloved of God. Like, in and outside of the church, why should God's beloved not be taken care of? So how often does God talk about in Scripture to, rest? How often did Jesus get away to rest? Even though people were on the shores, begging for healing, he still got in a boat and peaced out, So I think there's plenty of evidence that, we need to get away from it all and find some rest and some peace.
That's awesome. So what are some common misperceptions that people have about therapy?
Yeah. I still get really surprised how many people I see in my office who will still say, I'm not sure I should be here because I think God should heal me instead of therapy. And that really does hurt my heart because that tells me that there is a view of God that is fearful of if I must be doing something wrong if I have faith in God and I'm still struggling with depression or I'm still struggling with an addiction or a trauma that's haunting me. So I would say that's a big misconception, especially people of faith. And sometimes a lot of that is connected to that person's trauma, which then affected their image of God, which then affects how they're able to heal. And I often talk to them about our invitation to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And sometimes things have happened in our lives from people that have messed with the way that we think about things. And so we might not even be able to think about God in a really healthy way until we clear up some trauma and until we clear up some wounds that have happened. So sometimes that can be a slow process for people's buy-in. I will also say another big conception is therapy is only for crazy people. I'm not crazy enough to go to therapy, or I don't have it that bad. But I'm a therapist. I don't know what I'd do without my own therapist, my own spiritual director. I too am on medication for a panic disorder and some depression as well. And my spirituality is greatly impacted by all of those things. And if I don't take care of any of those things, I'm not able to be a full functioning, loving person in the world. And sure, sometimes I feel crazy. But we all have our own version of crazy, but we don't have to be hanging naked from the ceiling kind of crazy, to get help. But, so yeah.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I don't think it's any secret for people who knows. We have a therapist, a family therapist, that we just have an ongoing appointment with once a week, and one of us shows up to, or the whole group of us. So it's a really important thing for us and our well-being. So some of the terminology that you used when we talked was really interesting, and I want to say some of this is going to sound self-explanatory, but it's deeper than that. So I was wondering if you could talk about spiral dynamics. I'm just going to go down the list.
Okay. Has anyone heard of spiral dynamics? Okay. I will not say that I am an expert, but this has been really helpful for me to think about how to be with people, how to help with people on a lot of different levels. So spiral dynamics sort of looks a little bit like a tornado, and it has to do with levels of human development, levels of, what is the word I'm looking for? Consciousness. So, for example, the lowest level of consciousness, it kind of goes by color, is a red level of consciousness. Now, for example, someone who might be running our country right now may have a red level of consciousness. And that level is all about power and control, just simply who has the power, and always wanting that need for power. So somewhere a little bit down there is a lot where evangelical Christianity is, which is more of the blue stage, which is who's in and who's out, And so a lot of people who even will come to therapy or spiritual direction, I'm kind of thinking like, which level of consciousness are they in? Because if you take a progressive standpoint to someone who's in a red or blue stage, they're going to not ever want to come and see you again because they need some help moving to those different levels of consciousness. So generally, those of us who are in more of a progressive place, we're thinking a little bit more about earth care and inclusion and those types of things. So that's a few levels down as well. And so the pattern of human development is to kind of keep going through those levels of consciousness and those levels of development.
Okay, that's great. So layers of exposure you talked about, and you talked about big T and small t traumas.
Yeah. So I'm an EMDR therapist, which is a certain kind of trauma treatment that works with the brain. I'm seeing some head nods, so some of you know what I'm talking about. And so it's a kind of trauma therapy that works with, like I said, a big T trauma, like like witnessing someone being killed or a rape or something like that. That's maybe something we consider that big T trauma. But it also treats a lot of little T traumas that we often don't take very seriously. Like, we might have a current negative belief about ourselves that we just have lived with for years. Like, I'm stupid, I'll never be enough, God hates me, anything like that. And we just kind of live with it because we think it's the chatter that's just in our brain. But a lot of times that comes from some small T traumas. Maybe it was like when you were 6 and you rode the bus and someone told you that you were dumb. And so now you're like 45 and you still believe that. So it's kind of going into those little T traumas to be able to find some freedom and wholeness from that as well.
So you also used, I actually wrote down the quotes. You talked about helping to untangle issues and providing a soft space to land. And you talked about how exploring the divine allows for self-defining terms and a place to shake your fist at God. And I think both of those are so important. I wonder if you wanted to expound on those a little.
Let's see, the first part was what?
The first one was helping to untangle issues and providing a soft space to land.
Yeah. So I think I was talking a little bit about trauma and about spirituality. Because I think, like, the thing I'm probably most passionate about, especially with progressives, is untangling the church wound. Because I think so many of us get stuck in cynicism, and I know myself too, like, I can get stuck in cynicism when a lot of things happen, when the church continues to wound people. And my biggest passion is to help unwind that so we can find our true selves and actually pursue whole spirituality again. Because so often we stop. We get cynical and then we stop. We stop our pursuit of anything spiritual, which doesn't benefit ourselves or the world or anyone. And so in spiritual direction and or in therapy, it can kind of help unravel a lot of that big ball of yuck that has maybe been our negative spiritual experiences, so that we can kind of find the ground of who we are as deeply loved and purposeful creatures. I'm trying to think what the other piece was.
Exploring how the divine allows for self-defining terms and a place to shake your fist at God.
Yeah, so spiritual direction also is just a great place. I know I did that for a few years, and sometimes I still do that with my spiritual director. To just get angry. I think we don't often allow anger in the church either, because we almost see that as unspiritual, and especially shaking our fist at God. There seems like something unsacred, unholy about doing that, but it's also so important. The Psalms are filled with phrases that talk about, like, why, God? Like free me from this. Like, are you going to forget me forever? I mean, come on. I think a lot of us have felt that way. Like, where are you? When I listen to cases of sexual abuse, that is almost always my "where are you, God? Where were you?" kind of questions. And so spiritual direction really does provide that safe, non-judgmental space to just, like, have it out. So.
Okay. So this is pretty much our last question. I also want to say, this isn't, I mean, if you connect with Lori, that's great, and you want to seek her out for therapy. This isn't intended to be an infomercial for come and see Lori. This really is about finding whatever you need as a support system for your own mental health, and also being aware that we all connect in different ways. Like I said, we've got this family therapist that's just amazing for our family, but is not great for maybe some other people. And I think that connection is vital. When you find someone that you really connect with, to utilize that. And that may be formal therapy, that may be a friend or a partner. I think transparency in relationship is huge too. And I'm just going to throw this in there. One of the things that I've always been appalled by that happens in the church are these accountability groups for, usually they have them for men dealing with pornography. You got your accountability group, and it's usually married men, and it provides this safe kind of atonement where come and talk about your pornography here, and then you're not sharing with the person that you should most be sharing with. And it also addresses pornography as just a male issue. So anyway, that's one of my things that I have seen over the years, and I think it's so detrimental. But speaking of issues like that, sometimes what keeps us from therapy are these foundational issues that manifest as guilt and shame. And it can be hoarding or pornography or addiction or perpetrating abuse or being victimized by abuse and failure in relationship. So how do you provide a safe space when you're dealing with such heavy issues? I mean, it's already a milestone for somebody to walk into a counseling office with those types of issues as it is.
Yes. So how to create a safe space. I think Brene Brown, who's a shame and vulnerability researcher that some of you might have heard about, talks about the only antidote for shame is empathy. And I would say on the Strength Finders test, my number one is empathy. And I think God has used that in a really beautiful way, because in the way that I'm able to be with people in their pain, I needed someone for me in my pain, in my own story. And so that allows me to really take a slow process with people. There's a spiritual teacher, Teilhard, who says, trust the slow work of God. And I think that's generally how we're able to kind of show up in therapy. And instead of, the first day, you're going to drop everything and then say there. Some people do that, and that's fine. That can be their personality. But some people are shaking when they come in with, like, I made it in the door. I don't know that I still want to open this up, but I'm going to put one foot in front of the other. And so I think for myself as a therapist, I'm not a therapist that I feel like is hierarchical, like I'm the therapist and you're the client. I also believe you're going to teach me some things, and I'm also someone who's going to constantly say, me too. You know, like, do you feel crazy? I know I feel crazy sometimes. So kind of bringing it to a level of like, yeah, abuse hurts. Addiction is real. And you are still worthy of finding that wholeness and healing in your own journey.
So at this time, we want to open it up for questions. I don't know how this is going to go over because this is a, oh, yay, thank you, Terry.
I do get a lot of questions about insurance, and this is often a deterrent for people. I do not take insurance, but I will tell you why. So when I have worked with insurances before, they give you like a certain number of sessions that you can have, and when you're working with spiritual issues, with trauma issues, there is no way you can put a timestamp on that. And sometimes it's re-traumatizing people to really push them through really fast to do those types of things. So I will say I work at an agency where we have a huge variety. We go down to $50 a session, you know, up to a lot more than that. But if that's an issue, please, you know, talk to me. I know Pastor Brandon has mentioned, you know, if there's a problem with that, probably it's a church
Right.
staff thing to talk about as well.
Yeah.
But yeah. that's-
And we definitely have resources for insurance.
Are there a lot of spiritual directors? I've actually never heard of the term before. And
Yeah, me either.
therapy sessions. So.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so there's it's called SDI, Spiritual Directors International. So every actually religious tradition has a spiritual direction. So there are Buddhist spiritual directors, there are Christian spiritual directors, there are Hindu spiritual directors. So there's an international kind of chapter, but San Diego also has San Diego Association of Spiritual Directors. So you can see a whole list of spiritual directors in San Diego. Different locations, different things that they work with, different costs, those types of things. So, yeah.
Other questions?
Would a good therapist ever tell a first-time client or patient or whatever the term is for somebody that you see after the session that they don't need therapy? I have a friend, and a lot of his other friends told him that he should talk to somebody. So he went to talk to somebody because we felt he needed it. And he went to the therapy session, and he said that the therapist said that he really didn't need therapy.
Oh my
And I said, that's not a really good therapist if they told you that. I'm not sure if he was being truthful or not, but I don't think that a therapist that has any credibility would say that to somebody.
Yes. I'm so glad you brought that up because that was something I wanted to touch on is some of you may have had trauma from a therapist, and that is also real. And I would never tell a person after a first session that they don't need therapy because oftentimes the first session, even if we don't seem to talk about anything significant, we're still building trust. We're still building a relationship. And maybe I have a client who comes in and talks about the weather, and I'm still not going to tell them they don't need therapy. I had one woman who she had like multiple levels of, well, abuse in her own home, abuse from a spiritual place, but also abuse from a therapist. And she didn't want any feedback. So for a whole year, I never gave any feedback until she was ready to ask for it. And so, no, if you've had therapists who have been negative to you, who have approached you physically in a way that's inappropriate, or have even just said like, there's nothing wrong with you, or if they tell you that you're crazy, all of those things are not okay. So just saying that out loud.
Well, the impression that I got was he went to see this therapist and he told this such a rosy picture. You know, he wasn't being truthful in what was really going on. He was painting this rosy picture so the therapist could think good of him. And
Yeah, and that there's plenty of times when I'll have clients paint a rosy picture, and especially like the classic word like I'm fine. Okay, so why do you keep showing up? You know, or like if you're paying me, like how can I benefit you? You know, do you want to talk about? And I might start with something small, like how do you feel at work? Do you like your job? You know, something like that before even pushing into like your relationship with your parents, or do you have any trauma that we should just jump in with right away? So again, like, especially if a client is telling me that they don't have anything wrong when they come to their first session, I know that they do, you know, and it's big. So I need to tread really gently and really lightly.
You mentioned Brene Brown. Can you recommend any other authors or readings that you think maybe we could look into? Do you recommend?
Any particular topics? I know that's sort of exposing for you, but
I think just where you have found some spiritual food or nutrition, something that really resonated with you, something that you're like, God, I wish everybody had a chance to read this.
yeah.
The Bible.
Right, yes. And sometimes for people, the Bible is not the right time for them to be reading that because that's even a source of trauma for them. So let's see. So I'm also enrolled in Richard Rohr's Living School. And so if you haven't heard of Richard Rohr, Falling Upward is a really great place to start. Yeah, and lots of Brene Brown just to start with the shame and vulnerability piece. I know you guys just had Kent Dobson here. His Leaving Church and Finding God is really great with that spiritual process. For those of you who might be in a place of like, I haven't felt God for a while, or you're in a really dark place of facing your trauma or those types of things, Gerald May has a book called The Dark Night of the Soul that's also really helpful. I also will say there's a book by Sue Monk Kidd called When the Heart Waits that is really beautiful with the transformation process. Because I'll say this piece too that I wanted to make sure I mention. I think oftentimes we've come from places, from church communities that are about following rules rather than in the way that Jesus lived his life, right? Like I think we could probably all pick that out. But something that I've really come to believe and notice is the process of death, burial, and resurrection in our own lives. So whether it be death of the ego, death of trying to hold some trauma that's been there for a while, death of pride, death of lots of different things, and holding that in a dark place for a while before resurrection comes is not only a pattern that we find in nature. A seed goes into the ground before it's able to sprout and grow. Lots of pieces just need to die for new things to live. And I think that's the pattern that Jesus taught us too. And sometimes we're so afraid to die to things that we won't find resurrection. We're so afraid of the dark that we won't find resurrection. So that pattern being really important. And Sue Monk Kidd's book sort of talks about that from the vantage point of the way that a caterpillar merges into a butterfly. So
That really ties into recovery also, letting go of things.
Totally.
And, oh my gosh. That's
Totally.
profound.
People in recovery really have to die to a lot of things. So
Okay, we have time for one more question. Oh, okay, I see two. So we can do two questions.
My question is, in regards for spirituality and therapy, which paradigm within the psychological perspective of, psychoanalytic or CBT therapy do you feel really fits in with therapy? And then how do you deal with issues such as sex as a spiritual director and also combining with therapy? Because I think a lot of wounds from people within the church that have
Yes. And I will also say that is part of my passion. If any of you have my card, it says sexuality on there as well, especially people who have been in the church and have no other place to talk about whether you're having difficulty sexuality with your partner, whether you have a sex addiction, whether you're single and you have no idea what to do with your sexuality. People just don't necessarily talk about that. And generally, I'm kind of someone who just kind of brings it up because it's a big part of who we are. So I think like you might find that people who label themselves as like Christian therapist, potentially, not all of them, but some of them can have a little bit of an agenda of, okay, you're having sex, so we're going to try to help you not have sex because either, you know, you're not married or whatever the Christian context is. And as a spiritual director, like, and a therapist, it is not my job to tell you what to do. So especially in the track of spiritual direction, I'm only going to ask questions that deepen your relationship with yourself and with the divine, that are questions that bring you closer to wholeness and not at all about any Christian agenda. You know, what does it feel like to be sexually active outside of marriage and still believe in Jesus? You know, rather than like, you can't do that, you know, those types of things. So I think you're right, it is a topic that has been misused for sure. When you combine sexuality and spirituality, you really never know what you're gonna get, unfortunately, with a lot of therapists. But it's a good question to ask before you see a therapist, like, what are your personal beliefs on sexuality and spirituality, and how would you address someone who's having this type of thing? And then that first piece that you talked about, like a therapeutic orientation that I might have, like psychologically, you mentioned like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a lot of like, do these 5 behavioral things and you're gonna get to this place. And that works for a lot of different places, like addicts, like eating disorders, those types of things where you need like behavioral structure. My own personal orientation is around like more depth psychology, so I'm going to help you get to some really deeper parts of yourself and process that rather than giving you 5 ways to fix it or 5 ways to change your behavior. If that makes sense.
The question is really, if any of us have someone in our life that is in a dark space and maybe their illness is preventing them to even see they're in a dark space, but you're very conscious of them being in a dark space. What's the best way, or is there a successful way to introduce them to some type of therapy, some type of help?
Yeah. That can definitely be tricky. I would say the best thing that you can do is bring yourself to their level of, man, I remember a time in my life when I was struggling with a really difficult piece and just wondering how to get out of there. And, you know, I know what that feels like, and I would love to help you find help to get you out of that dark place. Do you have any suggestions? So asking kind of what they're thinking first, so you kind of are gauging where they're at before it's just like kind of a slap, like, I know how you are feeling, I know what you need, and therefore we're doing this thing. So asking some questions and, you know, even suggesting like, I would love to pay for you to get some help. I would love to help you find help. What might that look like from your end? So asking questions and providing like some ways that you might be able to assist them as they make that decision.
That was a great question to end on. Are you okay hanging out in sacred grounds for people who want
Absolutely.
to connect with you
Yeah,
after? Okay.
absolutely.
All right. Let's give Lori a hand. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Okay, this is the time where we move, if you want, you can put that right back on the stand, where we move into communion.